We are being streamed now, so I
Okay,
guess you can.
great. So I'm going to start in about a minute. Mm, okay. So after the races. So it was a lovely debate. We really did truly enjoy listening to it. We also had a great discussion and ended up with a consensus call in which the first place goes to opening opposition, the second place to closing government, the third place to closing opposition, and the fourth place, unfortunately, to opening government. And let's go down that explaining all the calls. We're going to go from the first place down, just because we think it's the clearest way to conceptualize this debate without doing any unnecessary comparisons, because it's, the end of day 3 and our time is all valuable. So OOCG. So OO basically advance a claim. So, before that, let's discuss like the main clashes of the debate, the main questions that govern it, right? The first is a question about quality, and it hinges around A, how easy or difficult is this thing to teach effectively, and B, how controllable, regulatable, sort of internal control mechanisms of doing it well and feedback mechanisms from consumers and the public. Second question is quantity, same sort of question division. Third question is the weighing between those two. And within quantity, also the question of which groups, right? A group of people who are facing significant mental issues, a group of people who are facing moderate mental health issues like anxiety or stress, like not to, understate that, but lower intensity mental issues than acute depression. And therefore, which of these groups is more important? Where does the quantity lie? So now, using that to compare both teams. From OO, we get the idea that mindfulness is something applicable writ large to society because of this issue of like the narrative that it counters. There's a highly problematic narrative of achievement, and we could all do with little mindfulness, both because apparently according to OO, the majority of us are coping with moderate mental health issues, but also those who aren't are still under that sort of thing. With regards to difficulty, they give us the idea that it's not that difficult. It's a sort of practice. It's a sort of exercise that you can learn and then do, and it's also a skill that you can have and then develop or teach. And lastly, with the idea of quality, we're given a sort of feedback mechanism, which is if it's good, then you tell your friends it's good, and if it's bad, then you tell your friends it's not that great, and it isn't that difficult to assess whether something affected you positively or negatively. Let's bring CG into that. So CG advanced a few claims. A few of them we found strong and believable. A few of them we found not as strong and not as believable. So the first claim is a claim about social change. We'll talk about how we assessed it comparatively in a minute, because it is obviously new and OO didn't have any chance at all to engage with it. But what that means is that we assess believability for a claim. When we have no chance for engagement, we have to extrapolate a little more in assessing how believable the informed neutral observer would find that claim. We think there are a few issues of believability. Helpfully, like they were pointed out by CO, not that that ties into this comparison in any way, but it does attest to them being approachable or concerns that one may raise. First of all, the sort of like scope of the problem and whether it is a tipping point or a turning point. Second of all, the issue that what essentially SideGov is regretting is status quo. And so essentially what we are ought to believe is that status quo prevented more protest, like just from where we are at. And thirdly, the status quo in the East, I think, is a believability problem, right? Like Mahayana Buddhism not necessarily being completely introverted. So I think these are the sort of things that the informed observer would bring into this when assessing how believable that claim is, especially the things like being as little interventionist as possible, the things about we just didn't prove that there's a large impact here, that there's a large tipping point or turning point for a lot of people, but also attesting to the intuition of that claim. Obviously, we didn't treat it as if someone gave you all three of those rebuttals, but rather assessed how persuasive someone would have found that claims, knowing that there are certain issues with the claim. Obviously, they couldn't have given you a POI that says all of those things at once, and that's not how we assessed it, but we did treat it as smaller because of this engagement problem and this persuasion problem. Then there's the second part of CG, which we think is actually quite good, which is basically it's going to be marketed as a cure-all. That is bad, especially for people with chronic mental illness, because that then undermines that or prevents them from using other means. And then some engagement in WIP, which is also important. A lot of it is with CO's stuff, but when we do talk about it, I think going down as we went down and looked at what claims are relevant to OO. So first about regulation of word of mouth. So again, no direct answer to the issue of it coming from a personal experience of positively or negatively. We do get that since it's in your head, it's hard to evaluate, but I think that's an assertion to an assertion. And A, I place a higher burden on CG coming later, and B, I think the assertion from OO is slightly more intuitive. Same with the self-blame issue, etc. With characterizing courses as a one-off, I don't think that characterization is necessarily true. I think, especially when apps being characterized, that's something subscription model, so not necessarily in that idea, but we do get some of it. Ultimately, we were left weighing somewhat different groups because I think we all thought CG is able to prove a certain harm to the group of people with actual mental illness, being sort of sold this as a cure-all, and some of them definitely believing that issue. That is then traded off with OO showing an impact on what is a large swath or even the majority of society benefiting from this easy access to mindfulness. OG don't really do a lot, CG don't really do a lot to weigh off those groups and explain why the issue of the severely mentally coping people is the more important one, whereas we feel OO does do the inverse, right? OO does say this is a very prevalent problem, this is a somewhat effective solution, we'll just enact it and we'll get the solution. So if we're left with this little intervention way off these groups, we have to think that OO did a more explicit and a better job at weighing why the group that they clearly win is better than the group that they more clearly, or at least somewhat clearly, lose. So that is the short diagonal. Then bringing in CO. So we had a lot of trouble with CO stuff because essentially you have to really, there is a lot, and some of it is derivative, definitely. And then we have to do a lot of hair splitting with what isn't derivative and to what extent. So this is going to be a mouthful. It's not going to be the shortest OA ever, but it's fine. But essentially, so first of all, with quality, the mechanism given by OO, this mechanism of self-assessment followed by word of mouth. Then what we get from CO is people can judge themselves, that's OO. People can compare and talk to friends, that's OO. People can use reviews online. This is a new mechanism, but do note that it is logically very, very similar to the mechanism that we got from OO. It is doing the same thing with people who are strangers online. And then the last area where we think there's actually substantial extension from CO is the idea of like certification and industry-based feedback mechanisms. We think reasonable work done there. We definitely think there is an extension there. We definitely think it is persuasive to an extent. They want to market, so they'll create certifications. Hopefully these certifications won't be bogus, but somewhat missing there, but reasonably well enough done. And lastly, on research and being able to create funding, again, somewhat derivative, because what OO tells us is there's a lot of money in the field. That's repeated, unfortunately, in CO. CO add a new argument, which is you have a larger client sample, which is really cool and good in science. Again, an independent claim, surely an extension, but not necessarily one which is better than OO. Why did I do this entire comparison to OO? Not because I need to compare this team to OO, but because it's extremely important to understand where exactly the extension is and what the persuasive contribution is. Because at the point at which I'm already persuaded to a certain extent that these things are true, establishing them through different mechanisms is not necessarily the largest contribution there is. The second question is also, as you noted in the OA for the short diagonal, quite a lot of leeway was given on the issue of a lack of ability to engage. This obviously doesn't apply in assessing the back half. So let's go down the engagement with back half. So with the issue of the thing we found most pertinent in the CG case, i.e. people with severe mental health issues, sort of engagement that we get is trading off that population by saying, listen, if there were the sort of like snake oil people snake oil buying people to begin with. They didn't take their issues seriously, and so wouldn't have been gained on either side. We think that this rebuttal is somewhat dependent on a slight mischaracterization of what CG in fact do. We think their argument has a little more nuance than that on how it's actually presented to them. It's presented as a cure-all on the social effects of consuming that, along with other people who attest to success and on all of these other things. So we think the CG claim is left standing and quite persuasive. Looking at the inverse engagement, then essentially what we get in response is some responses to the advertisement and the certifications not necessarily being incentivized to be the best, like to be very reliable, i.e. advancing the perception of quality rather than actual quality. This gets an answer which is somewhat insufficient from opposition whip, which is that quality leads to perception and vice versa. But that is dependent on having a strong assessment of quality in the consumer side and a way to propagate it, which we think is a partial answer and mitigatory at best. And with regards to the stuff about quantity, that's more of a similar situation where they try to trade that off with a different group of people. This is probably also a time to talk about like the, I don't know, 7 different contradictions that CG were accused of. Like, I mean, actually 2.5 or 3. Debaters tend to be really trigger happy with the word contradiction. So I'll just go down them in case any of you are worried that that should have factored into the decision. With regards to the first contradiction, which is allegedly that OG say mindfulness is good and CG say mindfulness is bad. Both of these teams seem rather intent on the idea that underdeveloped, low quality mindfulness is very, very bad, and they seem to be entirely consistent on that. There is somewhat a point of inconsistency about whether it will be effective or not, where OG like sort of say, this will look less believable and people won't go to it, but I actually agree with the way GovWhip presents it, which is OG to begin with said that the right people won't go to it, but the wrong people will be drawn to it, and the CG perception is actually quite consistent with that. And the third possible tension is that if it's so harmful, if marketing has to be effective in order to get like the social change harms, so then if you go and rebut marketing, that's wrong. But we think that's a pretty solid and tight, even if like obviously side opposition all characterize marketing as quite effective, and so it's not direct contradiction to address the case in which marketing is effective. So in case you thought that was an issue, this is how we saw all of that. So understanding all of that and engagement as we tracked it, ultimately the last issue I'd like to talk about in that back half call is that whereas OG sort of present why we need mindfulness for the masses with what I just talked about earlier in the short present why we need mindfulness for the masses with the stuff I just talked about previously. CG actually don't do it. And so the logic, it's not that it becomes circular. It's not that it's useless, but the idea of why mindfulness is good is somewhat abstract. And then to say that they can trade off mindfulness, losing on mindfulness for the mentally ill for good mindfulness becomes less persuasive when the idea of good mindfulness and the benefit of good mindfulness is somewhat abstract, especially when that is specifically challenged by CG in a way which I just explained why we don't find to be contradictory. So that is the back half call. Long diagonal, so OG versus CO. So I think mostly a lot of the OG make quite a good case. I think the strategic selection is good, and ultimately what they say is it's a quality quantity trade-off. You're likely to sort of have a bad experience, and so a lot of analysis on why if there is low quality mindfulness, that is a bad thing. You get discouraged, you can't succeed in this, you don't reach solutions. Some people misattribute their solutions to the sort of stuff that CG does, but with different mechanisms and possibly a little less analysis. And in general, you don't have the right access to this solution. Unfortunately, where we sort of lack analysis is on why it will be so low quality. And the rationale is because you want to make it sexy, because celebs are advancing it, because talk shows are advancing that. We just talked about all the quality stuff that CO has. I would like you all to know that this sort of a comparison turns on the characterization quite strongly, because the characterization of OG for why quality is low is that commercialization is about goop, talk shows, and YouTube videos. Characterization for CO and why it's good is it's because of apps, gym-like, course places, professional trainings, like the more sort of Headspace, Calm, Coursera imagination type thing. So if you buy one characterization, then OG's claims are more believable. And if you buy the other CO's claims are more believable, we ultimately find CO's characterization to be a more believable characterization of what, in fact, the commercialization of mindfulness is as it happened in the world and as OG now want to regret. This makes claims about the lack of seriousness perceived in the field less persuasive, and claims about why you want to be perceived as serious and you want to create certifications and you want to create professionalization more credible. And thus CO beat OG. That's it. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. It was a great debate, and feel free to approach all of us for feedback. It was a really great discussion, and truly everybody contributed loads.
Are you going to be available now for feedback, or you got to go do your CA stuff?
No, I'm not seeing. I'm just...
Oh.
But you're not seeing?
No, I'm in the room with Siang, and I debate partnered for a million years with Siang, so it's easy to get confused with Siang. So it's easy to get confused. But I am the person in this love triangle who is not Siang. No, I think you can approach me now.
We can just like stay in here and like.
Yeah, maybe.
And also, sorry guys, on Discord, are you okay if your questions are streamed? If you're gonna ask them now?
I don't mind. Yeah, well, you know what? Let's not. I want to be like, people need some candidness, and candidness doesn't always photograph well. So I think, any questions about OA definitely, and personal feedback, we'll try to take that in later.
It doesn't say it's recording on the thing.
No, but it is live.
Is it? Didn't know that.
Yeah. And